Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for a second appearance on the podcast, David French. David, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Now, you're a senior editor at the Dispatch. We're going to talk about your book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, which came out 2 years ago. But I think I warned you that guests always introduce themselves, so I'm going to put that on you. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, so I'm a senior editor at the Dispatch, which is, I guess we're not that new anymore. We started almost 3 years ago, new conservative media outlet. I'm also a contributing writer for The Atlantic, recovering lawyer who still dabbles, veteran, husband, father, live in Tennessee.
Recovering lawyer. What was that line about? Well, he was a journalist in Texas. Jim Hightower. He said the only step down from journalism was that into politics. So is from law to is law to journalism a step down, step up? What is? How do you?
I would say it's a different world. I would say journalism is much more toxic than law. I'll go to bar association meetings for the collegiality compared to journalism.
When you say toxic, how do you mean? What? Give me just the personal attacks.
It's the
vitriol?
combination of both peer and public attacks. In other words, it's a remarkably petty, in many ways, culture, where people take a great deal of interest in other people's careers, and whether they're being appropriately promoted or appropriately rejected, it's not just enough to disagree with somebody. One of the hallmarks of particularly modern opinion journalism, is that it is characterized by efforts to demolish careers.
Cancel culture.
Yeah, and it runs right and left. I mean,
yeah.
When I was a litigator, I could litigate for years in intense cases against opposing counsel, and it could be sometimes quite heated, but it never crossed anyone's mind to say, well, not only should David lose the case, but his law firm should fire him.
Yeah.
That's not the way the culture of law works, even in intense litigation. But the way the world of journalism works is now, of course, not everybody. There's still some collegiality out there, but there is a culture that says, not only are you wrong, but I want to see your career destroyed, and a lot of the public picks up on that as well, and contributes to that kind of cultural churn, especially online.
Yeah, well. Yes, I avoid Twitter spats. I put my stuff out there. People don't like it. Okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to argue with you. I just don't have enough time. There's not even one keystroke for a critic. I'm sorry. I'm just too busy. So I was prompted to get back in touch after I read your column, your recent one on the God gap helps explain a seismic shift in American politics, because to me it was a really interesting. It was your Sunday column from July 17th. I want to come back to that, though, and I want to revisit now, because we're almost 2 years after the publication of Divided We Fall, which was September 2020. So this is the first question I had was, is the country more divided now than when the book came out? And if
yes.
So, how can you tell? Is January 6th? How is it more divided, and in what? Give me specifics.
Yeah. So essentially what you're looking at is a combination of things. It's a combination of both incidents and data. So when I wrote the book and it came out in September 2020, even though I was pessimistic about the cultural and political trends in the United States at that time, I did not foresee the dramatic divisions that would erupt both during the pandemic, and I did not foresee the violence of the election contest. So I finished the book in March, April, May of 2020. By the time the book comes out, two things followed then by a third occurred. One was the pandemic, which in a healthier culture, the arrival to our shores of a common threat would bind us together in a healthier culture. And even as I was putting the finishing touches on my book, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was thinking, this is going to be an interesting test of my thesis that we're coming apart, because it could very well be the case that between March, April, when I finished the final edits, and September when it came out, that we're a unified country confronting this awful shared challenge. It was the opposite. We had a very brief honeymoon period where people were kind of all in this together, the effort to level the curve and to stop the spread for a very brief time.
Get everybody vaccinated, wear masks, all of these things that were about community or community spirit fell apart because of the lack of trust in institutions. How do you explain why that was? It the lack of trust in institutions, lack of just the left-right divide? I mean,
if you put on top of all of the dysfunction that I described in my book, the shared if you put the pandemic on top of all of the dysfunction, the fact that we don't just distrust is too mild, hate in many cases, loathe in many cases, people on the other side, that what ends up happening is that anything that is seen as coming from the other side is then begins to be automatically rejected. Often reflexively rejected. And so the instant that aspects of the pandemic response became to be seen characteristic of red or blue is the instant they became completely polarizing. So where I live, masking was seen as kind of a blue thing, and people just rejected it. I mean, and this is early in the pandemic. This is pre-vaccine.
Yeah.
Similarly, in big parts of the era, even though the vaccine came from Operation Warp Speed under the Trump administration, a bunch of people where I live see the vaccine as sort of a deep state kind of establishment response, and they reject it, even though they've never been anti-vaccine before. Similarly, on the left, you saw, holding on to masking even outdoors, beyond the time when we all knew that masking outdoors was ineffective, or holding on to school closures well beyond the time when science would have dictated and we had the information that we needed to open schools. You had these things that if all you told me was what is the pandemic response of this town or the state, I could immediately tell you if it was run by Republican or Democrat immediately.
Because of those public signals, the ones,
yes, exactly.
These kind of signals about what your affiliation was, right? Or
exactly.
And you're in Franklin County, Tennessee.
I'm Williamson County, Tennessee, which is Franklin.
Okay.
The town of Franklin. Yeah.
Town of Franklin. Okay. Williamson County. So you're just outside of Nashville, right?
Yes. Right. Yes. And so, and then the other thing that occurred was, so the murder of George Floyd, which we had for a moment, this incredible outpouring of anguish and sympathy. And then you had political violence arise out of that. Right. So that is deeply polarizing. And then you had the election, followed by the lies about the election, followed by the storming of the Capitol. So each one of these things after I wrote the book dramatically exacerbated existing divides in the country. I think folks in Blue America don't fully appreciate the extent to which the widespread rioting, a lot of folks in Blue America don't fully appreciate the extent to which the widespread rioting in the summer of 2020 was deeply alarming to people. And then a lot of people in Red America are very upset and aggrieved that people continue to focus on January 6th, even though January 6th was rightly deeply alarming to people.
Right.
And so, so each one of these things happens, which further separates us. And I have seen zero evidence since January 6th that we are any closer together. And there's no evidence in polling. There's no evidence. And in fact, I believe it was either late last year or early this year when a poll came out that indicated that 52% of Trump voters would be okay if blue states left. 40% of Biden voters would be okay if red states left the union. So there are a lot of indications that we've gone through some traumas and have attitudes that have further divided us.
Well, one of the other reasons I thought of you, and just recently, a few weeks ago, I was invited to speak to the North Austin Republicans. Now, who knew there were Republicans in Austin? I didn't. I thought
There's a few. Yeah.
there apparently is a few. So I was flattered to be asked. And of course, oh, sure, I'll come talk to you. I'd never talked to that group before. And, it was an interesting crowd, but I laid it out. I think it was a day after one of the January 6th hearings. And I thought Liz Cheney had just done an amazing job. I mean, just, risking her political career, but the way how measured she was. And I just said, look, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. And I said, it was on a Friday. I said, if you watched that hearing last night, you should be disgusted too. Cause I just thought, well, I'm talking to Republicans. I'm not going to act like I'm one of you. I don't know. But I was leaving and this woman said, well, I don't know why you're talking about that. Or what you're watching the wrong TV channel. And
yeah, I know.
I said, she said, you must be watching CNN. And I thought, well, wait a minute. First, we don't have a TV in the house anymore. We moved it out, but we watched it on C-SPAN, or I don't know, we watched it online, and it was really remarkably compelling and moving to me that here government, in my view, is working, right? That they're investigating this, and this is really important. And here it was an old, well, I guess she was maybe my age. I was about to say older. That's me.
Yeah.
Saying, oh, you're just listening to the wrong news outlet. And I thought, okay. And I was polite, but I said, look, you're deeply misguided here. The Republicans you need to find somebody else besides Trump. He's a cancer on your party. And she just was like, I can't believe you're saying this. And I just thought, but to me, that just brought you to mind again, because I think it validates what the things that you're observing. So let's talk about January 6th. I said what I thought about Liz Cheney. You spoke to her on the Dispatch podcast just recently. How do you see her as kind of I hate to say it. Well, I'll say it this. I'll ask it this way: as a historic figure now, because of her role in this really is rather historic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think she is a historic figure. Whether she'll be a politically successful figure is another question entirely.
We'll find August 16th, right? That's the primary in Wyoming, no?
Right. I mean, it's so whether she's politically successful is one question. Is she historic in the sense that she is doing what needs to be done to not just expose what happened on January 6th, but potentially develop and cultivate the facts that could lay the precedent for, a world historic event, the potential prosecution of a former president of the United States. Again, let me say this about Trump's prosecution. I think there are grounds to prosecute him. I don't know that he will be prosecuted. Right. In fact, as of right now, if you made me guess, I would say no, but mainly because of political and cultural considerations, not evidentiary considerations.
Right.
So I think she's a historic figure.
To me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is what you see in banana republics. This is what you see in countries that, oh, well, the president's out of power. We're going to go, clean his clock and put him in prison. And that's not the American. I mean, historically hasn't been the American way, but if the facts are the facts and he deserves to be indicted, we'll indict him and put on a trial, but it's going to be, I think, more divisive.
It would be divisive, but the thing is, historically in America, we do prosecute public officials who are corrupt. Yeah. That's one of the things that makes us not a banana republic. Right.
Look, I'm from Oklahoma. I understand this. There's a law.
I grew up in Kentucky. And if you don't think that state has had corruption problems, you can Google something called Operation Bop Trot that goes all the way back to like the late 70s and early 80s. And
Bop Trot.
BOPTROT. Just Google that. Your listeners will enjoy reading that story. And so one of the things that actually separates us from being a banana republic is we hold our officials to the rule of law. And that is true. That's been true at every level. We have prosecuted ex-governors. We have prosecuted members of Congress. We have prosecuted every layer of American public official, but not a president. And to me, the test here is the president immune? Is the president beyond the rule of the law? Now, what I will say is I do not think we should prosecute a president on a novel legal theory. I don't think we should prosecute a president when the facts of the case are unclear. It should be a clear, provable case. But if you have a clear, provable case and you do not prosecute, that's banana republicanism.
Well, so how would that even work? I mean, one of the, you're a lawyer. I mean, who would do the indicting, and where would the trial be held under? And
So
what court?
there's two grand juries right now. One is a state grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia. So the state grand jury that is run by a state prosecutor, the district attorney of Fulton County, would indict under Georgia state criminal law, and that trial would be held in Atlanta under Georgia criminal law. And so if Trump was indicted, and I don't know if he will be, if you make me predict it, I would say probably not. But if he's indicted by that grand jury, he would be tried under Georgia state criminal law in Fulton County, Georgia, and could be convicted. And the interesting thing is, if he was convicted and imprisoned, he would serve time in a Georgia state penitentiary, which is just a remarkable thing to think about, a potential presidential imprisonment in a state prison. But now here's what's interesting.
Brings a whole new level or thought, or a new level of meaning in federalism, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. Now, the interesting thing there is, because it's a state prosecution, a president doesn't have the power to pardon, but a governor would. A governor can pardon for a state prosecution. It takes a president to pardon for a federal prosecution. So that's one. The other one is grand jury, I believe in D.C., looking at this, and that's for federal criminal offenses. And we do not know if Trump is a target of the federal grand jury. I think if you're looking at what's the most obvious target right now of the grand juries, it's the fake elector scheme, the scheme to put to try to get a alternative slate, fraudulent slates of electors. Why is that such an obvious target? Because it's just basic black letter law, as we say in the legal world, that fraudulent votes are unlawful. And the fake elector slate was an attempt to introduce fraudulent votes. And so the fake electors themselves are in real jeopardy, and anyone who directed the creation of the fake electors is in real jeopardy. And what we don't know is how much was Trump himself involved in that aspect of the effort to steal the election.
But it's been, I listened, it was on Dispatch Live, your podcast, and it's interesting. It's on Liz Cheney's website. That was where I saw it. There was a link there. But she said they already interviewed 1,000 people. I mean, the investigation has been, and the way it was presented, I thought, I mean, as I watch it, just as a presentation, as a media presentation, very well coordinated, right? You know, the way they lined up all these witnesses and the way they presented the video, all seamless. I mean, very well put together. That to me was impressive, but also just the kind of the theater of it. I mean, it was really compelling as a, I hate to say entertainment, but the line between politics and entertainment has been blurred here. But I mean, how did you perceive it watching some of these witnesses, Cassidy Hutchinson and some of these others, these, people who were Republicans and stood up and said, this isn't me. This is not my party, or I'm going to speak up. I mean, as a human story, it's incredibly compelling.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is, you're exactly right. It was done very well. For those of us who've grown used to useless hearings and governmental incompetence, it's pretty remarkable to watch a presentation put together competently, and a compelling presentation put together competently. So that's one thing that's compelling about it, just the presentation. Number two, the composition, who is speaking. Right. As Liz Cheney has said many times, all of these witnesses are Trump Republicans. These are not Democrats coming forward with allegations against Trump. These are all people in his orbit coming forward with allegations against Trump. So that's number two. Number three that's compelling about it to me, and this is the lawyer in me, because there's an old saying in the law that says, if the facts are on your side, pound on the facts. If the law is on your side, pound on the law. If neither the facts or the law are on your side, pound on the table. Yeah. There's a lot of pounding on the table going on about the January 6th hearing. Show trial, no adversarial process. Okay, I get it. I get it that there's no adversarial process in the sense of real cross-examination. But what you do, if you're a lawyer and you have a client, or if you're, you're a communications professional and you have a client, and there are facts that exonerate your client, but they're not being articulated on television, what do? You bring forth the facts that are exonerating your client. You don't hold them back.
Right.
You don't not talk about them. You bring them forward. And we don't see that out of the people critiquing the January 6th committee. Instead, we just see the same talking point all the time. Show trial, show trial, show trial. Well, wait a minute. If there's something you have to offer, no one is stopping you from introducing the evidence that you have to offer. And the interesting thing is that some of the evidence that they've tried to offer to exonerate Trump has now been repudiated under oath. So, for example, it was a talking point for a long time that people went on Sean Hannity and said, well, Trump had tried to bring thousands of National Guard troops to the Capitol before January 6th and was rebuffed. And the Secretary of Defense at the time says, no, that never happened. And he says that under oath.
Right.
So under Hannity is not as compelling as under oath. So
that's funny. Well, what I'm hearing you say, because one of the questions I wrote down here was about January 6th. So January 6th is just more evidence of this division. And,
yes,
as I watch it, though, as I watch some of those tapes, I was thinking, frankly, I mean, who are these yahoos that are dressed up like this? And what do they think they're doing? I mean, how was it that they were in such a state of mind? Because I've been in the Capitol. I've been lucky. I've toured the White House. I mean, to me, they're not churches, but some of those buildings, the Library of Congress, the Jefferson Reading Room, those are just marvels of American things, right? American buildings. And the idea that they're assaulting them with weapons, and they're taking weapons. What do you think you're doing? I mean, that was the part that as I watch that, I'm just gobsmacked at this kind of virus that was in these people's heads. I mean, what's your reaction to that? Because you watch these same things, right?
They believed the lie. I mean, they believed the lie. And so if you believe that an election to the president of the United States has been corruptly reversed, that is, and I wrote this in December. I had seen a lot of the rhetoric circulating, throughout November and into December. And I said, if you tell people the nation is in a state of collapse because of a stolen election,
and that Mike Pence is the one that's responsible, and if only you lynch him, then this is divine retribution.
There have been revolutions for less, right? I mean, if you're talking about, does someone believe that the present government or the government about to be sworn in is fundamentally illegitimate and the result of corruption and a stolen election? If that is actually the message, and that the entire United States of America will collapse if this stolen election is allowed to, you allow the election to be stolen, doesn't surprise me at all that people stormed the Capitol. Does not surprise me at all, because they were operating under they had been told two things. Joe Biden will destroy America. I debated people in the run up to the election because I was for neither Trump nor Biden. And people were trying to tell me that my Christianity should compel me to support Donald Trump. And I was debating people on that point. And they would say, Joe Biden will destroy America. So they're saying Biden will destroy America, and then they're saying he's taking power through corrupt means. It doesn't surprise me at all that people rioted in that circumstance.
Wow. I mean, I'm I think like you, I'm incredibly optimistic about America. I kind of get misty about it because I think the Constitution is just almost a perfect document. I mean, just the strength and the how it's endured. But I see so many fractures in America today. And I spend a lot of time in rural America, and the differences I see between, ranchers I was talking to in Nacogdoches, and, these are the anti-elite. I mean, they are the non-elites, right? And they're worried about I was talking to a guy who drives a Snap-on tool. I love hand tools. I bought some Snap-on. He was at a gas station in Madisonville, Texas the other day. And I bought a few. I said, how's business? He said, oh man, it's bad. He's paying $1,200 a month for his diesel fuel. I mean, he's driving around all the time.
Yeah.
But as far away from the elites in America as you can be, I think. And it's a totally different vibe in those places. But compared to, what what I see on the the kind of well in the Manchin-Schumer bill. Let me transition to that.
Mm-hmm.
You're watching this closely. Is this seems to me another example of how badly perverted the parliamentary process in Congress has become. This pushing through all of this spending on hinging on one vote at the last minute in a reconciliation bill. Is this? To me, it's depressing. How do you? I'm trying to. How do you see that? The bill itself as just as a piece of legislation and how it's being handled.
I see the bill as kind of a historical rounding error. To be honest,
how so?
So we just have gone through. We just passed an infrastructure bill that was multiple times more consequential for spending. We've passed coronavirus relief that was multiple times more consequential for spending. This bill, compared to bills that have been passed in the relatively recent past, is pretty small. It's pretty small, but it is a political win for the president who was getting nothing. Because remember, Build Back Better was this enormous economy shaping piece of legislation.
2 or 3 trillion, and this is only 700 million, right? That's your rounding error. 700 billion is 700 billion is becoming a rounding error.
Compared to, when you're talking about the trillions that have been spent over since coronavirus hit our shores, the additional trillions. And so you went from the situation where you had this Build Back Better agenda that was supposed to be tacked on after the infrastructure bill that was immense, that was enormous. And he was going to get none of that. Now he gets some of that. He gets a fraction of that. And look, from his perspective, it's a political victory. But I think the significance of it over the long term, and what happens on Twitter is a lot of people take a look at what's a sort of a short-term political victory for Democrats, and then hype it and hype it and hype it. So I look at it as less consequential in many ways than some of the other massive spending that we've had that has led to the current inflation, it contributed to some of the current inflation crisis that we're dealing with right now.
Right. Well, so then let's talk about the midterms then. I'm going to ask you to speculate. We're still, many weeks away from the midterms, but not that far. And this could well be, with now Kirsten Sinema saying she's going to support the Manchin bill, that it looks like it's going to pass, and that it could be a win for Biden. And he can say, well, look, historic action on climate change, prescription drugs, and the rest of it. What's your sense in terms of going into the midterms? Are the Democrats going to get spanked? What do you have any sense of that?
If you had asked me 4 months ago, I would have said the Democrats this is a real potential for a red wave. But a few things happened at once. One, the Dobbs decision was handed down, and that's scrambling the political calculus in some pretty unpredictable ways. There's not too many people who saw the Kansas referendum coming out precisely the way it did, abortion referendum. They especially did not see the turnout. So a lot of people are recalibrating. The generic ballot has moved towards the Democrats. It's very hard to have a true wave election if the generic ballot is not in your favor. So you had the Dobbs decision. Then you had another thing, which was the Democrats suddenly started to get a little bit more legislatively competent. At the beginning of this year, they were throwing these huge, unpassable bills towards the Senate. And I was just sitting there as a matter of just politics 101. This stuff was just incompetent. They were sending bills that they knew, A, wouldn't get a passive filibuster in some cases, like, say, the Equality Act, and B, even when they could achieve something through reconciliation and didn't need a filibuster, they were sending stuff that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, they knew were not going to support, and then trying to fix that problem by harassing Sinema and Manchin, harassing them into compliance. That's a hope, not a plan, and it also poisons our body politic. So then what happened is the Democrats got a little smarter. They started having bite-sized pieces of legislation rather than these huge monstrosities. So gun control compromise. CHIPS Act is big. It's not bite-sized, but CHIPS Act. These are discrete items. Manchin gets them to Build Back Better into something more bite-sized. They send a marriage bill to the Senate. Again, much more bite size.
Right.
And so each one of these things are much more, so they got more politically competent. And then the Republicans are shooting themselves in the foot by being politically incompetent. So here you have a Doug Mastriano nominated in Pennsylvania, a very winnable governor's race. He might still win it, but he's made it harder. Carrie Lake in Arizona, she might still win, but she's made it harder. Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, again, he might win it, but he's made it harder. So time and again, they have nominated these candidates who are extraordinarily radical and undisciplined, and many of them just flat out dishonest. And that's political malpractice. Herschel Walker in Georgia.
Right.
How many secret sons does he have? And so you have a combination of what should be a Republican wave year because of the natural midterm advantage combined with a lot of rough economic news, mainly focused on inflation, instability in the world.
And a weak and unpopular president.
Right. All of that means they should be poised for a really historic sweep. But then the Republicans have gotten better. The Democrats have gotten a little better. The Republicans have gotten worse. And then the $64,000 Dobbs question is hovering over it all.
Which will motivate more Democratic women to vote, or women in general. Would you put
possibly.
It that way?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Traditionally, abortion in recent years has not been a high priority for voters. And if it becomes a high priority for voters, then the Republicans are in trouble. But if it stays a lower priority, then I think Republicans will be fine.
Right. You mentioned when you talked about the Dispatch, new conservative. How would you describe your politics, David?
Classical liberal, Reaganite conservative is the way I would describe it. Mainly, or another way of putting it is I'm a pro-life classical liberal. So I am I'm a civil libertarian. I'm a strong believer in the Bill of Rights. I'm a strong believer in international alliances, NATO, for example, our alliances in the Southeast, in the South Pacific. And so I'm a strong believer in American military strength, American military alliances, forward projection of American military strength. All of this is sort of classic Reagan conservatism. My civil libertarianism puts me out of step with some folks on the right, because I'm very focused on the protecting the Bill of Rights. And sometimes Republicans, unfortunately, have really focused on the First and Second Amendments, and less so on the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, all of the amendments that protect, for example, criminal defendants from abuse of the law.
Right.
And then when it comes to economic policy, I'm skeptical of central planning, but I am not a doctrinaire libertarian when it comes to economic policy. I'm very willing to experiment with policies like the Romney Family Security Act, which is a child allowance plan that begins prenatally, or I'm very willing to experiment with things like paid family leave. But I'm very skeptical of the notion of sort of central economic planning and the broad rising bureaucratic state.
Who are your political heroes? You mentioned Reagan.
Yeah. Reagan, and I have to say, some conservatives will get mad about this, but I think George H.W. Bush is one of the more underrated American presidents, just from the standpoint of sheer competence in the way in which he navigated this country through the end of the Cold War. He had
a lot of experience in government. He'd been in the CIA. He'd been all over the world. He was in business. He had a broad resume by the time he got to that job.
When I came of age, it was, we were very fortunate in the world stage with some of our leaders. So Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II. These are people who when I was coming of age, they were in power at a world historic pivotal moment. In many ways, I think of them as three of the most significant figures in modern world history. So each one of those three.
Reagan, John Paul, and Thatcher.
Yes. Yeah. And now I am fully aware that, if you're going to talk about Reaganism, you can't take Reaganism of 1981 and plug and play into 2022.
Teleport it to now.
Yeah. There's so many differences. But, one of the things about Reagan that I think was underappreciated. And I did a retrospective essay a year or so ago, looking back at his first inaugural. And one of the things that I do think there are parallels is he came to the presidency in a time when America wasn't just in a sense embroiled in a series of objective crises. In other words, stagflation, that's an objective economic reality. The Iran hostage crisis, that was an objective national security challenge. What seemed at the time to be in a rising or maybe even ascendant Soviet Union, again, an objective national security challenge. He also came into a time of really of a much more subjective crisis of national confidence. Remember in 1979, Jimmy Carter had given the malaise speech.
Sure.
What came to be known as the malaise speech, but the word malaise wasn't actually in the speech. But if you read that, aside from the factual particulars, you could move that over to 2022, and it would be a description in many ways of the American spirit now. A loss of confidence, a real uncertainty about the future, a real concern that our nation's best days are behind it. And one of the things that Reagan did, which I think was very, very powerful, is that he essentially identified, and if you look at his message to the American people, and this is my paraphrase of his message, this is my summary of it. He said to the American people, "You have not failed. You have been failed. People have failed you. You have not failed." So if you're looking at the aftermath of Vietnam, the American fighting man did not fail. The American fighting man was poorly led. If you look at the Iran hostage crisis, America is not weak. It is being led as if it is weak. If you look at the American, the collapse of the American economy, the American worker is not deficient. But the American worker needs better leadership. And so the unheralded, I think, part of the Reagan Revolution wasn't just that he sort of was more libertarian, or however you want to say it. It's that he imbued into the American people a greater degree of confidence, and he expected from the government a greater degree of competence. So it was that combination of confidence and competence that really began to turn things around. And one of the prime examples of that is the United States military. People forget that in the 1970s, the military was in a state of absolute crisis. Lack of trust on the part of the people, massive drug problem. And the military was sort of the biggest and most complicated government program. And here comes Reagan, and he's supposed to be the anti-government guy, right?
Yeah.
But he turns around the military so that by the time he leaves office, what was a decaying force where the American people and the military itself lacked confidence in, by the time that he left, was a colossus and a world historically powerful force. And the proof of concept of that was in Desert Storm. And then by the end of the Reagan-Bush era, the word that French diplomats coined to describe the United States of America was the hyperpower, not a superpower, the hyperpower. So why do I look at Reagan the way I do? It wasn't just his policy program. It's what he understood about the strength of the American people and the necessity of governmental efficiency and competence. That doesn't mean that the government was competent all the time when he was president.
Right.
But that kind, and so one of the things I would look for in a leader is somebody who can understand that and, for lack of a better term, say, make America competent again.
MACA. You got your slogan yet for the next election. Well, I'll just say Lyndon Johnson still is one of my political heroes. Vietnam was his great failure, but the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were America changing pieces of legislation that I don't know that any other president, would have taken another decade or more before that to happen and under another president. But that's an aside. Let me talk about your July 17th piece. I really do look forward to your Sunday pieces. You call it the French press, if I'm remembering correctly. And I'm going to read this paragraph here because the essay was called "The God Gap Helps Explain a Seismic Shift in American Politics." And with the subhead, it said, "The most important religious divide isn't between right and left, but between left and left." You wrote that in the 2020 election, the Democrats got whiter, the Republicans got more diverse, and now all of the assumptions are scrambled. Donald Trump lost the popular vote by a far wider margin than he did in 2016, but he did materially better with Hispanic, Asian, and black voters. In fact, Trump did better than Romney did with non-white voters in 2016. And then you go on and talk about the fact that the Democrats now have a bigger advantage with white college graduates than they do with non-white voters. And then you have this amazing graphic showing that non-white Democrats are twice as likely to believe in God as white Democrats.
Yeah.
So how important is this schism? I'll use that word in the Democratic Party, because I think that's how you were framing this, that the Democrats have a big problem because a big part of their voting bloc, their traditional voting bloc, doesn't align with the main people who are leading the party. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yes, this is a big deal, and it's not being covered enough. So if you
and it's all about it's all about demographics and religious belief, and how religious belief and demographics are combining for a political shift. Is that is that fair?
So the basic way to put this is, if you look at the religious beliefs of non-white Democrats, they are much closer to the religious beliefs of Republicans than they are to the religious beliefs of white Democrats.
Yeah.
So religious differences lead to cultural differences.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you said that in the piece, right? Yeah.
Yeah. This should be the most uncontroversial thing you could say, is that when you have religious differences, you will have cultural differences. Religion is not just sort of like a pair of, it's like wearing a different color shirt, right? Where someone who wears a red shirt and a blue shirt they're not all that different. No, religion, deep religious belief leads to cultural differences. And if you have, say, a population, let's say, and the most relevant right now are Hispanic voters, for a lot of very compelling historic reasons, I think it's going to be a while before black voters actually truly separate from the Democratic Party. But the real swing community right now are Hispanic voters. If you look at Hispanic voters, they are far more religious than white Democrats. And the way in which they're religious is far more like white Republicans, very evangelical. So evangelicalism, especially Pentecostal evangelicalism, is growing explosively in South America, and by extension into the American Hispanic community. And so you've got a lot of bonds there that are cultural. So it only makes sense that they would be political as well. And
therefore more inclined to support a Republican leaning message.
Right. And so now you've gone to a point where Hispanic voters, very small percentage, supported Romney, slightly bigger Trump in 2016, a little bigger than that Trump 2020, supporting Trump 2020. And now the polling before the midterms indicates that the Hispanic vote may be almost evenly split. And we haven't seen anything like that since George W. Bush's reelection campaign, in 2004, when Hispanic voters were a much smaller slice of the electorate. And so this is a clear trend. And I think the challenge that secular progressives have is that they have to intentionally maintain a big tent that includes people of small o Orthodox faith. If the culture of the Democratic Party becomes aggressively secular, it will be increasingly difficult to hold on to theologically conservative, non-white Democratic voters.
Well, let me ask you about that, because that was one of the things that I've thought quite a lot about, because I write about, of course, energy and power systems and the rest of it, and climate, and how people make climate change really kind of a religious belief. So for these more secular Democrats, is there a belief system that's replacing Christianity, church going, that you can identify? Yeah,
well, that's a really good question.
Because I see it the same, and I want to add this because in your piece you also wrote that in December 2016, and I'd never seen this before, that the executive director of the New York Times, Dean Baquea, famously told NPR's Terry Gross, "We don't get religion."
Yeah.
We don't get the role of religion in people's lives. And that rang true to me with, as I said, I spend a lot of time talking to, electric cooperatives and, people who are ranchers and people who work with their hands, and they go to church. I mean, a woman I know is fighting a wind project in Madison County, Iowa. I rang her up, and it was a Sunday morning, and I was on a deadline, was writing it for a piece for Forbes, a real quick piece. And she was Mary and Roy Probst, and they were in their car on the way to church.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I think when you're talking about what is replacing religion, any number of things can sort of replace religion. There are people who have a religious commitment or the equivalent of a religious commitment, say, to the environment.
Yeah.
That's one. I think the one that is more prominent in secular progressive spaces is the phrase that I didn't come up with, and it wasn't a conservative who came up with it, but Matthew Iglesias writing at Vox at the time. He called it the Great Awokening. And that is coinciding with this big decline in white progressive religious belief is a dramatic increase in sort of political radicalization around issues of gender, race, sexuality.
Yeah.
And so you begin to see a really sharp departure on the part of white secular progressives from even black Democrats on issues of race. White progressive tend to be to the left of black Democrats on multiple racial questions. So there was a sea change in sort of outlook on a lot of really important moral and cultural issues that coincided with the secularization of white progressive spaces. And so I think for some people, John McWhorter, writing in The Atlantic all the way back in 2018, identified a lot of the religious elements of this sort of awokening, that original sin is white privilege. And, there's sort of there are a lot of things that actually kind of map on to religious belief. Andrew Sullivan has written about this extensively. This is kind of an old news argument at this point. That doesn't mean that everybody who is on the left, even on the far left on race issues is part of some awokening or substituting religion for cultural politics. There are a lot of very faithful Christians who are pretty far left on a whole host of issues. But as a community, there has been in white progressive spaces, there has been a great awokening. And some of it has a kind of religious intensity to it. Now, I don't want because it's so fervent, and the quest for some kind of redemption in the public sphere or the public square somehow. Well, I don't want to say the word all, but I would say most people, almost every person I know, seeks a sort of sense of ultimate purpose.
Yeah.
Wants to answer the question, what am I here for? What is my purpose?
Sure.
And, religious belief is something that answers that question. But if you don't have religious belief, what answers that question? And so for an awful lot of people, that answer is found in the quest for justice or racial justice or, things along those lines. Now, the danger you see on the very religious right is that often they will confuse politics and religion. So in other words, some of the Christian nationalism you've seen rise up and what you saw on January 6th was rather than, they began to pour their Christian faith into their political engagement in a deeply unhealthy way.
Right.
I would never say that Christians should check their faith at the door when entering into politics, but to sort of argue that Donald Trump has some sort of special divine anointing from the Lord, and therefore it is evidence of satanic plans that he's losing an election. You've really crossed a bunch of lines there.
Right. Yeah, these ideas around redemption, I see it in a lot of environmentalism, right, and climate change, and this idea of our redemption is wind turbines and solar panels, or our redemption is the non-meat cheeseburger, or whatever. These are atonement methods, and so and the sin, of course, is and the ultimate sin is nuclear technology, because that's really biting from the apple, right? This technology of so on. But Let's talk a little bit about guns, because that's one of the other divisions in American culture as well. And you talk about that you've written about it, and you wrote a piece recently in the wake of Uvalde about your own thinking about guns and red flag laws, if I'm remembering, about how you're former military, you're a gun owner. How have your own views on this changed in the last, since the book came out?
Yeah. So yeah, I am a gun owner. I could arm Ukraine. But yeah, one of the things that I have really been focused a lot on is I've really been focused a lot on the mass shooting issue.
Yeah.
And because I think it is a nation shaking crisis. In the sense that each shooting itself is a monumental tragedy. And then the effects, the cultural and psychological and spiritual effects of each shooting as it ripples through the country it's just horrible. And so what can we do about this? And so I've been thinking a lot about what can we do about this? And here's a really sad thing is that we now have 50 years of research on mass shootings. Think about that. 50 years of research available on mass shootings in the US. And what that research has shown is that the majority of mass shooters broadcast or telegraph their plans in some way. In other words, they're radiating warning signs. So what can we do about that? It also happens to be the case, because we have far more gun deaths through suicide than we do for crime. That also happens to be the case with suicide. An awful lot of people who are suicidal, they express suicidal ideation. So what can we do when somebody is radiating danger signals? And that's what the red flag law is about. And the red flag law has the virtue of being targeted in much the same way that prohibitions against felons owning guns, or people who commit domestic violence own guns, or who've been adjudicated dangerously mentally ill. It targets behavior. And so, so it doesn't impair Second Amendment rights, because there's no proper conception of Second Amendment rights that says I have a right to own a gun, and casually express the desire to shoot up my school or my employer, right? That's, with rights comes responsibilities. And so this targets irresponsible and dangerous behavior. And it actually targets the thing that most mass shooters do. And so it's a very tailored remedy to what the evidence indicates is the problem. And it has the virtue that some other gun control measures don't. Rand Corporation did a huge study of studies of gun control measures and found that not one of the popular measures, like magazine capacity bans, assault weapons bans, has any effect on mass shootings. There's no evidence that they have a material effect on mass shootings. Now, red flag laws are too young. There's too few of them, and they're just been enacted to have any real rigorous studies on their effect yet.
Where have they been enacted?
So they've been enacted in 19 states in the District of Columbia, and most of them are pretty darn new. They became much more common after the Parkland shooting in Florida.
Right.
And so we just haven't had a lot of data. And then some of the states are wildly different in how much they use them and publicize them. So for example, Florida, which was just, it had its heart torn out by the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting, passed a age increase for owning a rifle, which I'm completely fine with that, and passed red flag laws, which I strongly support. And they've enforced red flag laws thousands of times in Florida, thousands of times. I think as of right now, there are more than 2,000 red flag orders that are currently in place. Illinois, which had this terrible July 4th shooting, has a red flag law, but it had only been enforced a few dozen times in a state of 13 million people. What does that tell you? It tells you nobody knows it's there. Not even the police really know it's there. They don't know how to use it. People don't know how to use it. But in Florida, they know it's there and they know how to use it. And so it's very important when trying to measure the effect of these things is a law that nobody knows exists might as well not even be a law at all.
Right.
And so these laws have to be passed and enforced.
But won't it be harder then to tell about or to even gauge what's not happening? I mean, you're trying to gauge what is a result that isn't occurring, right? Then
Well, that's what you're looking at.
But it also applies to Uvalde because, as I recall, and I'm in Texas, and I mean, it was terrible. I mean, it's not that far from Austin, but the kid bought a gun. I mean, just a few hours before the shooting, right? I mean, it wasn't long.
And the thing was, though, if red flag laws existed in Texas, his prior behavior would have qualified for a red flag order. And so, but again, if people knew about it, just the same with the Illinois shooter, the same with the shooter in Buffalo, New York, both of those states had red flag laws, but they weren't being properly utilized. So
right.
It's similar to the way we treat prohibitions on straw purchasers. Like, Americans, gun owning and not gun owning, broadly agree that straw purchasing for guns should be illegal. A straw purchase is when I tell you that I'm buying the gun for myself, but I'm giving it to somebody else.
Right.
And in those circumstances, but straw purchase bans are almost never enforced. Straw purchase prosecutions almost never happen. And so one of the problems that we have is we have some really sensible laws that are not enforced, that are not, that people don't even know about. And red flag laws in some states are like that. So I think the test of red flag laws is going to be longitudinal. You can never say, by seizing guns from John Smith, we stopped John Smith from a mass shooting.
Right.
We can say by seizing guns from John Smith, we took guns from somebody who had demonstrated by his conduct of behavior he shouldn't have a gun.
Right.
You can say that. But the evidence will come out over the long term. Are there more or fewer proportionate mass shootings in jurisdictions that pass and enforce red flag laws? What does it do to suicide rates? But we won't know the answer to that for a long time.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about things that, we've talked about things that are, in fact, depressing, and shootings are one of those. And the January 6th disaster was one, and the riots and so on are part of that. When you look around, what are the uniting things in America? We're both sports fans. We're both basketball fans. What are sports one of the things we can rally around? I mean, there's a lot of division around sports as well. But where are the optimistic things? You talk in the end of your book about the things that about having more tolerance for each other, and this virtue of being more open to people of other faiths, other backgrounds, etc. But where if we're going to see a less divided country, where are the uniting points?
Yeah, the point I make in the book is that we have a lot of ties that bind us very tightly right now. The problem that we have is that all of the pressures are putting strains on those bonds. We don't have big trends in America that are pulling us back together again in the same way that a lot of the trends are pushing us apart. And so one of the things that we have to do is we have to think through and remember what are the things that bind us together, and what are the things that make us feel that bond with each other, and double down on a lot of those things. And so, we do things as simple as sports do matter. I'm a huge sports fan, and I live in a very, very red part of the country. I'm a never Trump conservative. People who are Trump conservatives or Trump Republicans dislike us more than they dislike Democrats, and so there's no question about that.
You're the apostate. You're the heretic.
The traitor.
Yeah,
right.
You're the heretic. Yeah.
But even with people who might be the most MAGA person around, I can talk to them about, and we can have a 3-hour conversation about Nick Saban and how long is he going to dominate the Southeastern Conference, and we can become friends, and we can actually bond around this thing that is a part of our shared culture that we both love and we're both fascinated by. And so in our personal lives and our national lives, centering more of our communications and centering more of our identities around these shared, around shared experiences and shared values, rather than centering our communications around those values that are different and those experiences that are opposed, I think is an important thing. The other thing to remember about America right now is that it's only a minority of Americans who are actually driving us apart. The group called More in Common, which studied what it called the hidden tribes of America, found all the way back in, I believe it's 2018, that most of American polarization is is created by the most polarized wings of American discourse, the conservative activists on one side and the progressive activists on the other. The majority of Americans, both middle, left, and right, are what they called part of the exhausted majority.
Yeah.
Now, they might be Democrats, but they're sick of the division. They might be Republicans, but they're sick of division. And so one of the hopes that we have is that, one of the challenges is that the main operative word in the phrase exhausted majority right now is exhausted. They're the people who've pulled back. They're sick of it. Maybe they don't want to mess with their relationship with their parents or their uncle or their aunt or whatever. They don't want to be dragged on Facebook or Twitter or wherever. So they just pull back.
Yeah.
And so if you pull back, that means the polarized wings are driving the bus. So the hope I think that we have is to take the important word from exhausted majority and move it from exhausted to majority.
Yeah.
And have that majority
get more engaged.
Get more engaged. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, well, so you mentioned the SEC, so back to that. So are Texas and Oklahoma in for a rude awakening when they get into the SEC?
Yes.
That sure looks like it to me. This isn't the Big 8 anymore. You can't play Kansas every year. That's not going to happen.
Now there are weak programs in the Southeastern Conference for sure.
Right.
But you have far more strong programs. So, on any given year, you cannot count on going down to Mississippi State and Starkville, Mississippi, and beating them. Yeah. Right. Even though Mississippi State is only once in a blue moon in the national championship conversation.
Right.
Or A&M hasn't been a national championship contender truly for a while. But by golly, you don't want to go down there and play A&M, as Alabama found out last year. So it is. And then at the same time, you have these two super programs in Georgia and Alabama that are just recruiting and coaching juggernauts.
It is true that their players, football is kind of a guilty pleasure for me. I just, I see so many kids getting, they get hurt, and you see them taking off. And I'm just like, their careers are, it's a guilty pleasure, but I still have a guilty love of it. Right. But all their players look like they could go straight to the NFL. I mean, you look at them, they're the prototype. Oh yeah. He's 235 pounds and, 6'3". He's the prototype cornerback or whatever, the dimensions, the speed, everything is like, this is the fit. They could go to the NFL, but they're in Alabama as a way station.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about SEC. So is Ja Morant or your Grizzlies fan? I know. Can they keep Ja? Is he going to end up with the Lakers?
So Ja has signed his extension and
he did. Okay.
So he has, and this is really important. So he did not exercise he did not exercise a player option. In other words, he did not put a player option for his last year in his contract. So he is contractually now committed to the Grizzlies for the final year of his rookie contract, which is next year, and then the next, I think, 5 years after that. So there's like a 6-year tangible commitment right there. And they've locked up Jaren Jackson Jr. for several. He got his extension in the lingo of contract extensions in the NBA. He got his bag, and so you have a lot of the core has been locked up. And then the other thing is, look, the toughest test the Warriors faced in the playoffs was the Grizzlies. That was their toughest test. They rolled through their first round. They rolled through the Western Conference Finals. They had a few moments of nervousness around the Celtics.
Yeah.
But literally the Grizzlies were 2 missed shots away from knocking the Warriors right out of the playoffs. Ja Morant's driving layup attempt in game 1, Dylan Brooks's step back 3 in game 5. Was it game 5? I can't remember.
Boy,
I think game 4.
You are paying attention.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Robert, we could talk about this for twice as long as I could talk about politics.
So Ja Morant's your favorite player.
Oh gosh, that's a poster of him.
Yeah,
right
yeah. Well, I saw it back there. Steph Curry's my favorite player. But I'm a Spurs fan, and we've had some hard years here. But I still love Pop. I'm still a big basketball fan, so that's not going to change. And so, but let me just ask about that. Who in the sports world do you think? I mean, Bill Russell recently died. He was kind of a. I don't want to use the word transcendent, but a pivotal figure, I think, in terms of American sports in his era. and as a political figure and a sports figure and a cultural figure. Who do you see in that? Is there someone else? Is LeBron in that same category in terms of American sports figures? Steph Curry, of course, has, Subway contracts. He's kind of overexposed, even though he's my favorite player. But is there another player, right, or another sports figure today that could have that kind of stature of a Bill Russell, or that is not transcendent, a cross-cultural figure, I guess, to be
Well, so Steph is much less politically sort of resonant than Bill Russell came to prominence in one of the most pivotal and contentious times in American history.
Yeah.
So, you're talking about, this is a guy who, he ran the first desegregated basketball camp in Mississippi, right? He laid it on the line for civil rights and paid the price for it. So, it's not quite the same scenario now.
Yeah.
But
far different era.
Right. But here's, if you're talking about transcendent figures in the sense that people admire them well beyond their imprint on the court or on the playing field, Steph is one of the most well-beloved people in the United States. LeBron is polarizing politically, but what's interesting about LeBron is he's one of the more generous athletes and one of the more compelling role models in sport, because this is a kid who at age 18 was handed, he grew up without a father figure, 18 years old, kid from Akron, handed a giant pile of money. Like, if you did that to me in 18, even coming out of the good family I came out of, you might have found me in a ditch 5 years later, that how could I handle that?
But there's been no scandal. I mean, not even like Kobe with the marital infidelity or the womanizing, none of that with LeBron. It has been that part of it. I will agree with you. I mean, it's just, he's been remarkably consistent and, I don't know if the right word is, just there weren't no scandal.
He's been a model citizen. He's been a role model. Like he marries his high school sweetheart. He's a very public and present father. Yeah. He starts a school in Akron that is phenomenally successful in changing the lives of young students. And, you go through all of these things and it's sort of like, well, yeah, I disagree with a lot of LeBron's politics, but the real imprint and real footprint that he's having culturally and tangibly in people's lives is incredibly positive. And I just wish we could get past, a lot of my conservative friends sort of get past the idea that he has political opinions you don't like, and appreciate sort of who he is as a man. Right. And Steph is also, he's very publicly this great, he's a husband, he's a father, he's a philanthropist, he's
and a devout Christian, exactly. which is fairly unusual in the NBA as well. I mean, he's very outward about that, which is fairly remarkable in any sports figure today.
And so
we're any journalist, in fact. Let's point this out in your case.
And we're actually kind of, in some ways, with some of our non-political public figures, blessed with some people who are really pretty darn positive cultural forces. I've got to mention my guy, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Go ahead.
One of the things that's interesting about him, again, a guy who's very out there as a dad, a guy who's very out there with a very distinct perspective. And that is, he loves people. Like, he loves people. And in that sense, he's got this very positive cultural presence as one of the most famous and recognizable people on the planet. And I think, I wrote a National Review cover story about him a couple years ago. It was called "The Celebrity We Need." And, he'll make a political statement every now and then, but that is not the fundamental core of his identity. And I think that, that sort of that fundamental outward expression that he has at this cultural moment, a moment dominated by animosity, we need people whose public presence is dominated by affection. And I think that that's one of the most compelling things about him. Another person, again, he's a former athlete, obviously, someone who's not an athlete at all. One of the greatest living Americans, Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton. If you peel back the layers of good that woman has done,
Yeah.
for her community, for her state. It's
another Tennessean, right?
Yeah, it's almost staggering. One of the cool things about when you have a baby in the state of Tennessee is pretty soon you're going to start getting books from Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton, there are books that every single child in Tennessee gets as gifts from Dolly Parton to help with
you're
childhood
kidding me.
literacy.
I've never heard this before. Wow.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And they're sweet books and they come in the mail and it's really touching. It
sounds like she's one of your heroes.
Yeah, she's fantastic. She's,
the great quote that I remember from Dolly Parton, I don't know, was on Johnny Carson or one of the late night shows, but she was on there and the commentator says, "You look great." She said, "Well, it takes a lot of money to look this cheap."
She's a treasure. She's a treasure. And, that's the thing is one of the things that's so obvious about Dolly Parton is she is just exuding love and affection for this community, for this state, for her community. She's from Sevierville, the Sevierville area, which is East Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains. And, when there was a terrible wildfire there, I mean, she took the lead in rebuilding the community. So there are a lot of people out there who are really wonderful, good news stories.
And that are taking the lead in this kind of much more of a community focused or a
totally
public spirited kind of approach that you think that I think you make a good case is what is going to be needed to move past these broader divisions.
Yeah, because one of the problems that we have is that politics is becoming more important in people's lives at the exact time in the United States of America where the political class is with some notable exceptions, but as a general rule, the political class is it's the least impressive of my adult lifetime. It's the most sort of craven and cowardly of any political class of my adult lifetime. And at the same time that politics is becoming much more important to people, but at the same time that this political class is kind of failing us constantly, we have a class of Americans who are not prominent through politics, who are doing wonderful things for this country and for their community. And it's sort of a shame that the political figures have such cultural power, far beyond the cultural power that, I'm sorry, what's Josh Hawley doing writing a book about manhood? I mean, really.
I thought Jonah Goldberg's piece the other day about the double entendre. Well, today we're going to talk about Josh Hawley's manhood, and it's too easy. Well, let's move on. My guest, we need to wrap up here because we've been talking for more than an hour. Because love talking to David French. He's my guest. He's on Twitter at David A. French. He's a senior editor at The Dispatch, thedispatch.com, and he's the author most recently of Divided We Fall: America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, which I highly recommend as a book that was actually fairly prescient, published 2 years ago. Just a few more questions. Are you planning to write another book? I'm not, by the way. I've written 6, and I'm going to hang it up for a while. I'm not working on one, but I have to ask.
I am, but it is not yet started. So okay. I'll have to leave the topic mysterious. Yes.
Fair enough. Okay, well, I'm working on one too, but I haven't started. I like that answer. Yes, I'm working on one, but I'm not writing it.
Yeah, I know what I want to write. It's just that I haven't started yet. So
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So what books are you reading then? The last 2 questions. What are you reading? What's on the top of your shelf or top of your list in terms of what are interesting you these days?
Yeah, so I read mainly, this is going to be about like the most dad answer ever. I'm constantly reading military history. So right now I'm reading Ring of Steel, which is a book from a couple of years ago about the history of Germany and Austria-Hungary and World War I. I just finished reading historical fiction, Stephen Pressfield's new book called A Man at Arms. Stephen Pressfield wrote the book Gates of Fire, Legend of Bagger Vance. Absolutely fantastic book. Speaking of basketball, I just finished reading and again, this book is a few years old, but the book called Showtime, the history of the Lakers dynasty in the 80s.
Oh, right. Yeah. Which that is now really they made that into the mini series now. Yeah. That's been controversial.
Yep. So
Jerry West sued, in fact, on that or something for his portrayal in the TV thing.
Yeah, he's very upset. Although I will say as the season goes on, his portrayal gets better and better. So those are some recent books that I've been reading, and I'm I also finished a really good 1-volume history of World War II called The Storm of War. Finished another great 1-volume history of World War I called A World Undone. Like I said, it's the most dad answer ever.
Well, yeah, I don't know that my list is gonna, well, maybe not even that long, but it's but nevertheless. So last question then, David, what we talked about a lot of division and so on. What gives you hope now?
Yeah, what gives me hope is, to be honest, I have conversations like this. There's an awful lot of really smart people who love this country from across the political spectrum who are saying with sort of one voice, what can we do? And I would have a whole lot less hope if nobody was asking, if nobody seemed to care. But I have spent time, and we've spent some time in some common spaces with people who really care about what is happening. And I think the number one, and it's not just, actually I wrote the book in large part because even before 2020, that was one of the key questions that was being asked anywhere I went, was what's happening to us? What's happening to us? So I would say I have a lot of hope because a lot of people seem to care about what's happening. Now, will it be enough people? Will it be people who have enough moral courage to step forward and kind of swim against the tide when it comes to polarization? Remains to be seen. But I knew a lot of the best people I know in my life are deeply concerned about our national polarization and want to do something about it.
That's a good place to stop. David, great to talk to you again. Great to catch up. Great to catch up now 2 years later. Again, David's book, Divided We Fall. I highly recommend it. And then follow him at the dispatch.com on Twitter, David A. French. David, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And thanks to all of you listeners out there. Until the next episode, see you.